Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and welcome back to another unit roster overview for Total War Warhammer 3, as we'll be taking a detailed look at all 18 units in the Khorne faction roster today. Favoring brute strength and power, the Khorne roster is almost entirely melee. And while Khorne does not use magic, the weapon damage on most of their demonic units will be magical damage in order to help overcome physical resistances that would otherwise be way too effective against such a melee heavy roster. So with that said, let's jump in here and take a look at all these units in detail. Now, kicking things off with the cheapest infantry unit, we have the Chaos Warriors of Khorne at 750 costs. With 100 armor and a shield that blocks 55% of frontal incoming small arms fire, we have an excellent frontline unit. The stats across the board is pretty excellent. 75 leadership is pretty high. Respectable melee attack and defense as well. Weapon damage is mainly base, but it's still a pretty high value. Not too much charge on the unit. Mass-wise, 160. It's stronger than most human factions, but it's still considered a very light small entity unit at 100 unit per retinue. In terms of abilities, we have Frenzy, which complements the 75 base leadership quite well. As long as you can hold half of that value, you will gain 10% additional weapon damage for both base and armor piercing, 10% additional charge, and 8 points of melee attack, which is probably the biggest bonus here, and also immune to psychology, which means fear and terror will not be applied on you. Aside from that, nothing too special about these units. And if we move up by 100 costs at 850, we have the same Chaos Warriors of Khorne, except for this time they're holding a two-handed halberd instead of the axe and shield from the previous variant. And because of this weapon change, we no longer have a shield, we have the same armor, pretty much identical stats except for melee attack and defense is lowered by a bit. It's made up by a slightly better weapon strength breakdown of damage, not necessarily total damage, but we're now mostly armor piercing at 24, and we have a bonus against large of 19. And complementing that bonus against large, we have charge defense against large, which help us negate large units charge damage, as well as charge reflection, allowing us to deal double damage back at charging enemies. We still have Frenzy, that goes quite well with our high leadership, but because of the low charge bonus that we have, as well as the design of anti-large and charge negation on the unit, this is really a frontline anti-large option for the Khorne roster. One of the few, actually, as you're going to see. Most of the roster are rather offensive and anti-infantry. Then once again, returning to the Chaos Warriors of Khorne at 900 costs, we have the dual weapon users, dual axes. And as you can see from their aggressive nature and loud noises, these are going to be your shock infantry. So the damage and armor are very similar, more heavily skewed towards melee attack, and we have a weapon strength that is very much bonus against infantry, 7 points there, mostly base damage, 39 to 13, but a high total damage because of the dual axes. And once again, we have Frenzy, and we're going to let these guys calm down a bit as we swap over to another kind of infantry. And that type of infantry will be the demonic infantry, and this is the Bloodletters of Khorne. These will cost 800, and they are demons. And there's going to be a key difference between demons and non-demon units for Khorne. The main difference here being that demons' weapon will be magic attack, means they can bypass a lot of the physical attack, and we mentioned already, since most of the roster is designed for melee damage, you don't want enemies to benefit too much from physical resistance, so having some sort of magic attack on the weapon overcomes this, or else as a faction that doesn't use magic, you're kind of limited to only dealing with physical threats. And in terms of weapon strength, we're looking at a mainly armor-piercing weapon, the Great Sword here, and we get bonus against infantry of 9 points, decent charge, very low armor here, and another special attribute about demonic units is they have 3 demonic traits. So as a demonic unit, first off, we are immune to terror. We have special resistances, 20% physical resistance, 25% spell resistance. These are pretty default. But if we are ever shattered or broken, we start damaging ourselves as we banish ourselves back to the Chaos Realms. So this sort of kills off your unit, but we will never rout by ourselves. So essentially, we will fight to the end, but as we fight towards that end, we'll start killing ourselves as we lose our leadership. We will also cause fear, which means we're immune to essentially fear and terror. We just don't cause terror, and that's gonna keep our leadership high and prevent us from breaking and start killing ourselves with that banished trait. Then moving up to 1,200 cost, we have the Exalted version of the Bloodletters of Khorne, and these units will use a flaming greatsword, so that will add the flaming attack attribute, which will lower enemy healing by half and also cause more damage if they're vulnerable to fire. The weapon strength is increased, and the bonus against infantry is also increased. Stats across the board are just a bit higher, about 10 points more armor, 10 points more leadership, and so forth. We have almost the same traits except for the added passive ability of Hellblade, which means as these units occur more than 80 kills in a battle, they will gain 20% additional damage for the remainder of the battle. This figure is scaled based on your unit size, so we're showcasing everything on ultra unit size, and that is 80 kills. If you go down to small, it's just 20 kills, so it's a very even scaling, 20, 40, 60, 80, depending on the unit size that you're using. Other than that, not too much to add here, and that's going to round up all the infantry options for Khorne. Now, moving on to chariots and cavalry units, we have the 1,200 cost Gorebeast Chariots of Khorne. As you can see here, these come in 4 units per retinue, and they have a pretty high mass of 2,930. Of course, this number will scale based on your unit size. As we mentioned, we're showcasing everything on Ultra, so it will scale down to 1 on Small. As a Chariot unit, we have decent speed for being such a massive and heavily armored unit at 66, matching the heavy cavalry we've seen from Grand Cathay's units. The Jade Lancers have the exact same speed. Weapon damage is mainly armor piercing at 1634 split. We also have a very high bonus against infantry of 28. This is going to be a common theme for the Khorne roster. Charge bonus is extremely high as well, and if we look at abilities, we also have Frenzy, as we basically have the Chaos Warriors of Khorne mounted on these chariots, so we get extra bonuses to damage, and most importantly, charge bonus here, as well as a bit of melee attack and immune to psychology if we can maintain our leadership above half of our base value, so 35 is the magic number here. The melee defense is rather poor, so it's mainly about the armor here, and this is a pretty nice heavy unit to charge into the enemy formation with and eliminate their infantry with the high bonus damage against them. Then moving up to 1,500 cost, we have the Bloodcrushers of Khorne. Now we have the Bloodletters riding the Warhounds, that's heavily armored, 100 armor for these units, 70 leadership. Good amount of speed, although it is slower than the Chariot. It does have smaller mass because it's a Bloodletter sitting on them, it's not a Chariot, but still decent enough to cause collision and knockback with 1650. The melee attack is a lot better, so is the melee defense actually, and since it is a Bloodletter with their great swords, it's going to be magical damage as well, and that damage itself is quite high with 1842 with the base and armor piercing split, and once again, bonus against infantry of 18 points. Charge is a little bit lower, and it's going to have sort of the best of both worlds here. We have basically the traits of the Exalted Bloodletters, but we don't have the Flaming Greatsword. We still get Hellblade, so the more kills we get, once we get past 80, we'll get a bonus 20% damage. Aside from that, pretty standard demonic traits and resistances. Then lastly, at 1800 cost, we have the Skullcrushers of Khorne. Now we go back to the Warriors of Khorne mounted on the Warhounds, that's armored. So same speed, mass-wise, same as the unit we saw earlier, 1650. Heavily armored, included a shield with 30% range block chance from the front, and we have decent melee attack, decent melee defense, good weapon damage with 19 and 45 armor piercing, but no bonuses here, and we have the charge bonus of 70. We pick up Frenzy since we do have the same Warrior of Khorne sitting on top, so pretty standard across the board, nothing really to add here. Now moving on, we're going to be covering Monster and Beasts, which makes up the majority of the Khorne roster, And starting things off, we have the cheapest one here at 400 costs, the Chaos Warhounds. These you can think of as light cavalry for most of the other factions. They're not armored at 15, very low armor here. Leadership is low, but they're quite fast at 95 speed. Not much damage to speak of. Their weapon strength is also mostly base damage, very little armor piercing, and their charge bonus is not very high either. So essentially they are a small mass light cavalry that's good for harassing enemy range units and chase down kills. They will have Vanguard deployment to help achieve that, and a little bit of missile resistance to help them close the gap against those range opponents. But they are essentially a very weak unit that you should use with care, as they are quite fragile, but they are cheap. Then taking to the air at 550, we have the Chaos Furies of Khorne, and these are once again going to be your flying light cavalry sort of units. They're going to be good for harassment, very high speed. There's not many unit in retinue here, only 40, and the mass is quite light, as you can see. They are demonic, so they will have the magic damage, even though their weapon strength is not extremely high here, especially considering there's only 40 per retinue here. They have all the standard abilities. They will have the added benefit of Frenzy, which is kind of interesting here. So as long as they can keep their leadership over half, which is not a lot actually, they only have 35, so it might be quite easy to lose that half. You're only to lose about 18 points to lose the effect, but while you have it, you have basically 8 more points of the melee attack, 20% more weapon strength, and a little bit more charge bonus on top of immune to psychology. You are a demon, so all the banish and instability will be applied to you. It's mainly a harassment unit, and you also have the demon resistances of physical resistance of 20% and spell resistance of 25%. This is one of the few flying units available to Khorne, so that's also quite important. Then moving on to 700 costs, we have the Hounds of Khorne, which are going to be upgraded version of the Warhounds, and they're going to do a lot more in terms of what they can offer with stats. We're looking at a smaller unit with only 32 units per retinue, but at a greater mass of 450, which is better than infantry, but still not a massive unit by any means. It has good speed of 95, same as before, double the armor, a decent amount of leadership, attack is better, and you have magical attack on it because you are a demon unit. Defense is still pretty fragile. You're still an unarmored Warhound that's just upgraded with better stats across the board. Ability-wise, we still have Vanguard deployment, we have all the demon traits. The one special thing about these Fleshhound is they have double spell resistance, so they counter magic users quite well with 50%, and you can launch them at those units for the greatest effect of harassment and to be able to withstand their damage. Then speaking of monsters, if we move up to 1000 cost, we have the Spawn of Khorne. These are unbreakable, monstrous infantry, so they have extremely high leadership, unbreakable. They have no armor, really, only 10 points, probably the lowest I see in the game. Also very low melee defense. They're pretty much your glass cannon monsters that you charge in with high health as their only form of defense. They have good melee attack, they have decent speed for infantry unit, and very, very high weapon strength, even though majority of it is base damage weapon strength. And if you look at their abilities, they are considered siege attackers, so you can use them to break down gates and also launch sieges from the turn that you start the siege. They cause fear. They do have rampage, which means once they become wounded, there's a chance they could just ignore your command, attack the nearest unit, which is not always a bad thing, but sometimes you would like to have more finesse and control over the unit, and that's the Spawn of Khorne. Now moving up to 1600, we have a monstrous infantry that is a little easier to control. The Minotaurs of Khorne. These are going to be decently armored, high leadership, high damage, monstrous infantry. So if we look at the damage here with the twin axe, we're looking at the majority of damage being armor piercing at 77. There is going to be once again bonus against infantry. Aside from that, the stats are pretty average. I don't think anything's particularly high except for maybe the speed on these unit at 56 for a sort of infantry unit, although they are monstrous in size. And if you look at their abilities, we have the same siege attacker. The one new ability we see here is Blood Creed, and this is a slow buildup of Hellblade essentially. So you're still getting a 20% potential increase to armor piercing weapon damage, which is great for these units since they have majority armor piercing damage. There's a slow buildup of charge bonus up to 15% and up to 16 points of melee attack and immediately immune to psychology. All you need to do is start killing things. The more things you kill, the faster this stacks up in a battle. I believe it's probably 1% per kill actually, so it's not going to be that far off, and I don't know if that scales with unit size or not. If it does, I imagine it'll be 4 kills per 1% on ultra unit size, just given how Hellblade works. Haven't really tested this in detail. I don't know how they consider attacking single entities and other monstrous units, but essentially because of the fact that they have the bonus against infantry, you want to dive these bad boys with 1600 mass into enemy infantry and just start tearing them up and stack up your blood greed and turn them into better killing machines essentially. Then if we add 100 to the cost to 1700, we have a different variant of the Minotaurs with great weapons, and these are going to be targeting different opponents, whereas the dual axes on the original Minotaurs are meant to counter enemy infantry. These great weapon or a giant battle axe is designed to counter enemy large units, so we have the bonus against large at 28. Aside from that, all the stats are identical except for 6 more points of bonus charge on these great weapon users, and you have the same exact abilities. The key difference, as I mentioned, is the other variant's designed against infantry, and this variant's designed against enemy large units. So that is the key difference here between the two types of Minotaurs. Then moving to 1900 cost, we have the Khorne Soul Grinder, and this is going to be the first unit on the Khorne roster that have some sort of missile weapon. In this case, it will shoot this 3 projectile volley of missiles as it charges. It's a precursor missile weapon, which means there's going to be a slight different effect depending on if you have fire will on or not. If you have it off, then whomever you're charging, you will automatically shoot them as you charge toward them with your missile weapon. If you have your fire will on, then you automatically just keep firing at the closest unit within your range. So that's the key difference there. The range is okay, 120, and you have 40 ammo. Each of those ammo is going to have 3 shots that does 30-90 damage across base and armor piercing. Reload time is actually really short at 4.5, which is why the missile strength number looks so high. In terms of regular attack, we have that flaming greatsword that you see, and that's going to do a lot of damage, with most of it being armor piercing at 350, 150 base. It's considered magic weapon, and also the flaming attack is on for that sword. Stat is excellent across the board, nothing to complain about. It does have fire whilst moving, which makes sense considering you can charge and shoot it out at the same time. It will cause fear and terror, considered a siege attacker. It's considered a demon, so all the demonic traits and resistances will apply, and as a single entity in the game, it will have the Wounds passive ability, which means if it dips below 25% of its health, you will lose 20% of your weapon damage and 10% of your speed. Then lastly, for the monster roster here for Khorne, we have ourselves a regular Bloodthirster. Now, of course, we have Skarbrand, who is the legendary lord, being a famous Bloodthirster, and you can also recruit Exalted Bloodthirsters as lords to lead armies. Let me ask him to land, so he stopped moving around the screen. But you can also recruit regular Bloodthirsters as units in your army. They're going to be the most expensive unit in the Khorne roster at 2,300 for custom battles. And if we look at the stats, it's great across the board. We carry a big battle axe once again, does a lot of damage, 145, 335 breakdown for base and armor piercing, and a 25 point against large, which is the same as you expect from the great axe, which we already see on the Minotaurs, 2 different variants. It's considered a magic weapon, and I believe the flaming attack is more from the breathing animation that you saw with all the fires coming from him. In terms of his passive abilities, it's pretty much what you expect from what we saw with the Soul Grinder, except we have wings so we can fly, and we have the same resistances as any demon units. Of course, if you can get this unit low, you will have the wounds mechanic. If you can break or shatter this unit, you will have the instability and banish mechanic to help take it down. It doesn't actually have that much health, and it's a giant unit though, 4,000 mass, so collision with this guy is going to do a lot of damage. You are the only other flying unit in the Khorne roster, and that's going to be pretty crucial here, because if you think about it, aside from the Furies and the Bloodthirster, no other unit can fly, and with no magic and no range to speak of, you're going to do very poorly against other flying heavy armies. So Bloodthirster and Fury have a lot of tough jobs to do dealing with enemy flying units, so this is going to be something to keep in mind. Now, aside from monster and beasts, we also have a couple of machines, including this magic chariot here, the Blood Shrine of Khorne. It's a single entity unit with decent mass, 1725. You can see it's a couple bloodletters sitting on this motorcycle looking like chariot. It has a lot of fun spin collision attacks, and it will deal flaming damage as well. It breathes fire, and we can see that with the flaming attack and magic attack. The stats okay, it's not super high. It's heavily armored. The damage is decently high with a huge bonus against infantry of 24. Most of the damage is going to be armor piercing. It's going to be an anti-infantry chariot unit. In terms of ability, it's demon sitting on top of there, so we have all the demon traits, but we also have Gorebeast, which means it can heal itself if it stays in combat. It's a very low heal, so it's not going to keep you alive, but it's something to consider. It also has Encourage, which is coming from Tome of the Endless Bloodletting. We will give nearby units +5 melee attack and +4 leadership. This is pretty decent. It has the same resistances for all demon units, and it has the wounds mechanic because it is a single entity. It's also considered a siege attacker, so you can use this to attack gates and also to launch sieges right away. And that's going to be the Blood Shrine of Khorne. Lastly, the final unit here in the Khorne roster is the Skullcannon, which costs 1,100. And it's one of my favorite units for the Khorne roster because it has a range component and a melee component. So at the base, it's the same chariot looking machine that we saw on the Blood Shrine unit earlier, and it has the fire breathing attack in the front. It has the collision damage. It has good melee damage, 55, 125, bonus against infantry, once again 24, consider magic damage and flaming attack because you just saw the fire breathing component of this chariot. It has good armor, mass is decent, 1725. It is considered a single entity unit. Stat across the board is okay. It's a bit fragile for melee defense, but what can you expect? The range component is where it gets interesting. So we have 380 range. It's actually a fairly long range cannon. Shoots a flaming magical skull, which is why it's magic attack and flaming attack. It deals a decent amount of damage, 88 base, 352 armor piercing with a bit of explosion damage on top, 9.9 second reload speed. And the cool thing is, after the 12 ammo expires, it actually has a very fun passive ability called Skull Feast, because we're shooting out flaming magical skulls. If we engage ourselves in melee for longer than 5 seconds, we'll pick up an ammo from the fighting, basically rearming the machine with enemy skulls, and there's a 20-second cooldown. So essentially every 25 seconds you can trigger this once to rebuild your ammo supply, and you can then charge out and keep firing, especially since you can fire whilst moving if you want. It's considered a siege attacker. It will cause fear. It has all the demon traits and resistances. It also has the Gorebeast, which means if you stay in melee, you can actually heal back. So if you're using this unit to chase down routed enemies, you can rebuild your ammo and heal as needed before resuming your range attack if you wish. It has all the demon instabilities and banish, so nothing new there. And as a single entity, you will lose some melee component of your weapon damage, 20%, and speed if you fall below 25% health, but your range damage shouldn't be touched actually with the wounds mechanic, so that's pretty interesting there. Overall, that's going to do it for the Khorne roster. And as you can see, the Khorne roster is designed to focus heavily on melee units that specialize in countering other infantry largely, and without any magic, it might appear quite linear in terms of gameplay, which I actually believe is, first off, definitely intentional, as each of the Chaos God factions are designed to be unique and representative of their lore. But because of the simplicity of the Khorne unit roster, I think Khorne's actually a great faction for players coming over from historical titles or those who enjoy melee combat like that in Troy, as you can play out your battles focusing on maneuvering your units rather than focusing on spells. So that's going to be the Khorne roster, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit the like button. And if you want to see other previews and roster overview videos during this pre-release period, definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as I'll be covering all the playable factions before the game officially launches on February 17th. And if you want to know my exact pre-release schedule for Total War Warhammer 3, you can find my upload schedule on the community page here on YouTube, or in the announcement channel in my Discord, which you can also join using the invite link in the description below. So thank you all for watching to the end, and I will see you all next time. Bye!